Bethlehem College and Seminary is still accepting applications for the coming academic year. For more information, visit bcsmn.edu.
I don't think that you can have Joe's college roommate here without me sharing at least one embarrassing story. Yeah. Get that off? There we go, perfect. So we were actually together so much in college that people would frequently say, like, are you basically the same person? To which Joe would respond, for the most part, except he's nicer and I'm smarter. To which I would say, one of those two things is true. You can choose which one. In 1991, there was this interesting dinner party that took place in Seattle, and it was the first time that Warren Buffett, the Oracle of Omaha, met who would become one of his lifelong friends, Bill Gates. Two of the 5 wealthiest people in the world, and at this dinner party, which was actually hosted by Bill Gates' father, who's also named Bill Gates, so just works out quite well, he handed each of them a note card, and he asked them to each write, without sharing with anyone else, the single biggest reason for their unique success. And they each jotted down their answer, and it turns out they didn't just write one answer separately. They each had one word on that card, and when they flipped that card over, it was the same word, and that word was focus. Focus. Which is slightly problematic for someone who was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder at 12 years old. As a kid, I knew what focus looked like. Focus looked like my older, perfect sister. Does anyone else have the unreasonably perfect sibling? Yeah. Like, it would be the night before the term paper was due. We were pulling an all-nighter. That's how it happened, and she would be so helpful in terms of teaching me how to focus. She would say, Curt, there's a way that this doesn't have to happen. Just do it earlier. Which is about the quality of advice that I received over and over again on how a kid with ADD could learn to focus. And yet today I speak around the world on the topic of focus, which I think is basically the equivalent of having my 96-year-old grandmother teach you how to use TikTok. Not exactly a good recipe. But what Bill Gates and Warren Buffett understood, at its core, was the value and power of the attention decisions that they make. They understood that where you place your attention will shape every outcome that you seek. And we are not in a moment where it's easy to focus that attention, are we? I need you to be honest with me. Who has been on your device in the last 10 minutes? Come on, be honest, raise your hand. There we go. Who's currently on your device? Just kidding. I want to begin by saying that whenever people hear I speak and write about attention and distraction, the first place we go is to our devices, right? And we decide that the best way we can handle this is we're going to make an enemy of this technology. And I want to be very clear, this technology is incredible. In fact, do you realize that your phone, even if you have like the iPhone 6, it is more powerful, has more computing power than all of the computers combined that put a man on the moon. In fact, in 2010, the United Nations said that the smartphone was one of the greatest inventions in history for the alleviation of poverty. One of my colleagues was doing missions work in Africa, and they came across what's called an internally displaced people group. So they had fled a country that was in the middle of a war, and they were living on the side of a road with nothing. And in this group included dentists and doctors. By handing them a smartphone, they were able to raise all the money they needed to restore their lives. So what I'm not interested in doing is having a conversation around how you should get off your phone. And the reason is actually because just because you're on your device doesn't mean that you're necessarily distracted. In fact, I was, right before COVID, I was walking through the airport, texting my wife on the way to the gate, and somebody, I guess they'd seen me speak, they walked up and they're like, "Aren't you the focus expert? Caught you, you're distracted." I'm like, "You did, I am distracted by you." Just because you're on your device does not mean you're distracted. But if we don't understand the relationship that technology has on the way that we make decisions about what gets our attention and keeps it, then we will lose control of the very resource that we most desperately need to navigate this moment. See, what technology does is it distorts the relationship that we have with our space and time. What technology says is it doesn't matter where you are. You can be doing anything. In fact, when I am working with companies, I often will joke, like, you could be on a beach working. You could be at a baseball game working. You can be at work not working. Busiest hours of social media are 1 to 3 p.m., which means I better get done before 1 p.m., I suppose. What technology does is it says you can be anywhere and do anything, and it doesn't just do that. It brings the entire world's problems into the space that you occupy. In fact, Allison Holman is a researcher out of the University of California at Irvine, and they were studying a particular event, and I actually remember this event explicitly. It was in April of 2013, Boston Marathon. I remember this because my wife is a marathoner. I am not a marathoner. You're like, I know, relax. No, it's just so boring and also tiring. It's the other part of marathon. And we're seeing the very best of humanity, right? Just disciplining your body to achieve feats that seem impossible to most of us. And then 2 bombs go off 50 yards from the finish line, and we see the very worst of it. And what Holman's group was studying was the effects of acute stress on 2 particular populations. One population were those in range of the bomb. They experienced the physical effects of such a tragedy. The other group just consumed media on it, had no personal association. Which group, 1 month after and 2 months after, had higher levels of stress? The group that consumed media. You see, what this technology has done is it has changed the information game. And in fact, it was in 1971 that Herbert Simon, a sociologist, said this, that a wealth of information creates a dearth of whatever it is that information consumes. And what information consumes is obvious, right? A wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. And perhaps the best indicator of the value of your attention is in the amount of money that companies will spend to get yours. Do you realize that in 2021, $375 billion were spent in advertising in the United States alone? And we measure every moment of your attention as a unit with a single goal to move it up and to the right. That means tracking the likes that you do in social media, to how long your eyes linger on a page, to heart rate monitors judging your emotional reaction to political commercials. And the reason is really clear, because what gets your attention will drive your pocketbook. But that's actually just the very most shallow level of how your attention influences every outcome that you're seeking. The attention that you pay will shape the quality of your relationships, the quality of your efforts and the work that you're doing, the knowledge that you accumulate and your ability to remember it at the moment you need it. It will shape your view of the world. Are we going to hell in a handbasket, or is it looking up? And perhaps most of all, your role in shaping its future. In fact, a philosopher that I particularly like, Jose Ortega y Gasset, says it like this: tell me what you pay attention to, and I will tell you who you are. What gets your attention will define who you are becoming. And how often do we really think about our attention? Like this morning, what did you pay attention to? Not what did you do? It's like, well, I went on a jog. Great. What did you listen to? Or if you're like me, I put my attention on the need to go on a jog and found other things to do instead, right? We don't think often about our attention, but it turns out God is quite interested in the attention that you pay. And my favorite verse, or my favorite aspect of scriptures that really dives into the heart of human attention is the Shema. Deuteronomy 6. And I'm going to read this now, and I'm going to jump into the science of attention, which is really the core of my expertise. And then we're going to wrap it up, because this is a lesson in how your attention works and what God calls of us in order to put our attention on that which will make us more like Christ. So, I read for you. And actually, here's what I'd like to do. Historically, in ancient Israel, anytime the Shema was read in the synagogue, everyone stood. And so, only because you're going to be sitting plenty, I'm going to ask you to stand. If you know this, you're welcome to say it along with me. I should have put it up here. But, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. You can sit down. One aspect of the Shema that ties me closer to it is that Jesus, these would have been the first words in Scripture that Jesus would have memorized. The very first words. And what this text is actually doing is it's helping us understand how we can direct our attention towards things that matter. That's what it's doing. And let me give you a few key aspects of this that if you don't actually understand attention, you might miss it here. And the first thing that you need to know about your attention is that it is directed at the intersection of familiarity and novelty. Familiarity and novelty. And we'll start with novelty here. I like to scuba dive. Does anybody else scuba dive here? Okay, well, I'll make this story fast, since only two of you. I was scuba diving in Costa Rica, and I'm swimming in the ocean, and then all of a sudden, it just gets extremely dark overhead. And so I flip up to see what's blotting out my precious sun, and I see less than 3 feet directly above me a fish the size of a school bus. So I took a bathroom break. I start reviewing my options here. I've never been in this situation before. I don't want to die. What am I supposed to do? And I'm like, oh, but I've seen the movie. I have red hair. I die first. So we need a plot twist. It so happens that the instructor was right below me. And so I grabbed him and I flipped him between me and the fish. Because I paid him. He goes first. He did something I never would have expected. He swam straight for it. And the reason is he knew what it was, and I didn't. It was a whale shark, which is the largest fish in the ocean, but an entirely docile one. I share this story because it did not take my brain work to have something new come into my surroundings and reorient directly towards it. Here's one thing I missed when I started studying attention with a goal of getting a hold of my own. That God has wired us to have our attention driven by curiosity. And in fact, I would feel guilty that I couldn't focus. I'd be sitting in prayer and find my attention going to the latest Dallas Cowboys update. They would go all over the place like, why can't I focus? Because you aren't wired to focus infinitely. And when we think about curiosity, this is actually something that, for me, became an area of deep devotion. I remember as a kid hearing about heaven, spoken about in Revelation, and a kid with ADD that hears that eternity is me just in a long church service was not exactly what I was looking forward to. Just going to be honest. And as I started to study attention, I had this realization that we're wired for new and novel stimulus. And we have the only way to satisfy that is the Creator God who can constantly create new and new and new ways of seeing Him. And then heaven became something that the greatest joy, that we think about heaven as a place, as a kid, where nothing changes, where we worship the Creator God who wired us to explore. I see this in my daughter, and she's 3. Ruby is her name, and she's a terrorist. I love her, but from the moment she was born, everything in the world was new. Everything. And then she starts walking, and things got interesting. I'll never forget, my wife was going to the grocery store, and we have our 3 kids, and she's like, "Are you going to be okay?" And I'm like, "I'm pretty sure I'm one of the 2 parents, we'll be okay." I was wrong. 2 minutes into my wife being gone, I hear a crash in the bathroom, and I run in, and my daughter has ripped the toilet paper off the wall, and it's everywhere, including in the toilet. And so I'm cleaning that up, and I hear a crash, loud noise coming from the kitchen, and she had found the 2-gallon jug of vinegar and ripped it down. It's everywhere. And so I go to the cabinet where we had all of our cleaning supplies. I open it up. I grab what we need. I'm cleaning it up. I turn and I look, and she's grabbed a dishwasher detergent pill and has it half in her mouth. And then Child Protective Services came. Ruby was wired to explore. We don't need to feel guilty for being created in a way that makes us fascinated by new and novel and interesting. This is how neurogenesis occurs. Our brains grow in capacity by our fascination with learning, with synthesizing new and interesting information. You cannot enslave your attention. Attention is given to that which is fascinating. Once it's old and boring and tired, we don't pay attention to it. It wouldn't keep us alive. Now, there's 2 challenges with attention and our curiosity. The first threat is that in the face of infinite information, we become candy consumers at a buffet table. And we buy into the idea that because information is infinitely accessible, somehow we are infinite also. And we just consume, and we consume, and we consume, and we consume. Or there's the other option. The other great threat is that in the face of infinite, we shrink the sandbox so small, and we define our territory to a landscape that is simply not who God created us to be. I will never forget, when I speak at companies, I talk about the 4 pillars of focus, and curiosity is one. And I was having a conversation with my family, and one of the challenges that was leveled at me was, "Curt, curiosity is great for you. You were the kid that never stopped talking and never stopped asking questions. You're curious. I'm not curious. I don't resonate with that." And we start talking about where that came from, and at some point, we go back to a conversation that happened in early high school. And the member of my family was sitting in class, and she raises her hand and has a question. And this boy next to her, and I have to remind myself, he was a boy. He's assuredly grown since then. I do not wish negative on him. Maybe that he's stuck in a bad company's mid-level management, but that's a different discussion. And he turned to her and he said, "Don't you know it's your job to be quiet and be pretty?" For many of us, at some point along the way, we've been taught in subtle ways a lie about the limits of who God can change and grow and make you into. And we say, I'm not that person. That's not my interest. I don't care about that. I don't like economics. I don't like this. And we shrink the territory because it's infinite and it's unsafe. God made you to be curious. Your attention is fundamentally curious. It occurs at the intersection of novelty and familiarity. So we're fascinated on the one hand by new and interesting and exploring. This is who God made us to be. And then on the other end, we return to the things that are familiar. And this is why the Shema had the role that it played in ancient Israel. That the first thing that anyone who was a part of their faith would do in the morning is they would wake up and they would put on a prayer shawl with blue and white tassels that represented the Ten Commandments. And then they would grab the tefillin, which is, have you heard of this term? Is that, okay, so it's this black, small leather box, and in it is the Torah. And they would read the Shema as the very first thing they did. And the reason that occurred was that your attention, when devoted consistently to something, that expands in value and it returns to us more frequently. And so while we're born to be distracted and have our curiosity go towards the novel, we also ground ourselves in the familiar so that what matters to us is made clear by the rhythms by which we return to it. It also, so number one is that our attention is driven by curiosity at the intersection of novelty and familiarity. Number two, our attention is limited by human capacity, which is something that makes us different from God. That despite the fact that infinite information is available to you, that the equation of what you can pay attention to has changed. You can now be anywhere. You can respond to anyone. The simple equation of your attention is still a single digit, and that's one. That every decision you make about what has your attention comes at the cost of everything else. We can call our grandmother, or we can warm up the hot pocket, but we can't do both at the same time. And I want to get a little bit into the practical here. And who here would say generally, like, I can multitask? Yeah, okay. Who would say multitasking is a myth? Okay, you're both right or wrong, depending on which side of the playing field you want to say. It depends on the tasks. It turns out that there are some tasks that when we pair them, it actually accelerates our ability to focus. And then there are some tasks, when we try to pair them, has extremely negative consequences. When it comes to language, you cannot multitask. So what you actually are doing is you're task switching. We're going back and forth, which is completely fine as long as we know the consequences. And here are the consequences. Number one, when you are flipping back and forth, you're slower. 40% drop in efficiency on average. You're paying the tax. Number two, the quality of your thinking dramatically reduces. In fact, Harvard MBAs, when adding basic arithmetic to a primary essay, the essay was graded out at a second grade level. And not only is it slower, not only are you producing lower quality thinking, but we lose our emotional connection to whatever it is that we're doing. I don't like to book flights or hotels. Anybody like that? I'll hire you. Please do it for me. And, it can feel like just drudgery. It's another thing on a long list of stuff I need to do, right? That's what I think about when I think about this. Except for the fact that if I actually consider what I'm doing in that moment, that trip isn't just a thing on my to-do list. It's preparing for a weekend away with my wife. And if I'm fully devoted to it, I can actually step back and think about the incredible time I had in New York with her in February and the places that we ate. But when I'm flipping back and forth, what I do is I lose my emotional association with any of these things. Or maybe another way to experience this would be when we're watching television. Does anyone watch This Is Us? Is that still going on? I think it is, maybe. Anybody watch that? Yeah. So the purpose of This Is Us is really simple. It's to make you cry. Like, that's the reason people watch it. Like, during COVID, don't need it. More Ted Lasso, please. But there is a way you can reliably not get emotional when watching a show, and that's just have your second device out, which you do. Let's be honest, 89% of people when watching television actively use a second device. Now, I want you to consider the implications of that. When I was a kid, they said that watching television was what caused ADD. Now, if you can watch a 30-minute sitcom without pulling out your phone, you're the best we've got. We're slower. I'm sure you've been in that situation where you were called on by a professor at the very moment you were responding to your mom. You're like, what do you think? I agree. Or disagree? What do you think? And that's what happens. Our attention is limited to a single sphere. It's limited to a single sphere. You are limited, beautifully, radically limited. And it's actually through focusing your attention in a single direction that you can drive significant value in the world. Because it turns out you don't multiply value by dividing what's most valuable. And the narrative or the undergirding assumption in the world today is that your attention is only limited by your access, and the best way to handle today's world is to fragment it and divide it and divide it and divide it. And then we wonder why we're frustrated, why we don't feel progress, why the fullness of the impact we make is in sending out a tweet about our outrage. When we devote our full attention in a single direction, things grow. When we devote our attention in a single direction, we can learn and reuse that knowledge. When we devote our attention in a single direction, we have just said that there is something worth my most limited resource, and it's worth it at the cost of everything else. And the Shema is actually telling us what that is. That by remembering who God is and how He feels about us, that devoted attention in that direction will change everything. But our devices remind us of what else we might be missing and what else we need. And it's convincing us in subtle and consistent ways that just by consuming it once, you have it for good. That's not how God made us. Last area I have to talk about attention, because this was like a moment I thought, how did I miss this for so many years? And the Shema starts in a very interesting way. It starts, "Hear, O Israel." It turns out your attention is not your own at all. That fundamentally your attention is social. In fact, when a baby's born, something interesting occurs. Have you ever heard of attachment theory? Right, okay. A part of attachment theory is what's called joint attention. That the first 2 years of a baby's life, they are following and tracking the eyes of their primary caregivers. And the reason they're doing that is if the whole world is new, how do they know what matters? They follow the eyes of the people who they trust. This is also why Disney commissioned a study, and they were looking at what is it that kids pay attention to when they walk into Disney World. Because what we give our attention to is what we value. So this is important. Is it Mickey? Is it Minnie? Is it Donald? Like, what do kids care about? Number one answer, parents' smartphone. Because what people around us pay attention to tells us what matters. And the infrastructure of how that occurs has so radically changed. If I had more time, I would do a fun little exercise, but I also know I'm the only thing between you and lunch, so I want to be careful. But when you give your attention to something, like if I'm focused on someone, there's this phenomenon that occurs called mirror neurons. And there was a professor, if you ever remember the TV show, I'm guessing I'm dating myself, Lie to Me. Anybody remember this show? Okay. So, or the book, Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, was based off of Paul Ekman's research. And what his team was doing is they had people hooked up to fMRIs. And they were studying what happens to the brain when you have a genuine smile. And it's interesting, because when you genuinely smile, it ignites the reward circuitry in your brain, releasing, among others, the neurotransmitter dopamine. But where the study got interesting is that a technician walked through the room while someone was hooked up. They smiled at the participant, and the participant didn't react. They didn't smile back. But their brain scan said they did. And what they found is the way that we experience the emotions of other people, the way that we know how others feel, is that our brain says we feel it too. And neurons that fire together wire together. So literally, the people you pay attention to direct your attention, and you become more like them, and they become more like you. But in all of history, we've had a single devoted community that we lived in. We worked in the places we lived. We had one community. About 100 years ago, with the rise of the car, we saw technology, which is making all things into assured availability. By early 20th century philosopher defined it as that. What it did is allowed the people we worked with to be different than the people we lived with. So now you have two communities. Each community is a place where shared attention is directed. We agree this matters, and this deserves your individual attention for the overall group's attention. Right? That's how that works. And then we had two, so there's this division. But today we can connect with anyone for any reason. And so we actually have dozens of communities where we agree this deserves attention, we agree this deserves attention, we agree this deserves attention, and every one of those groups wins when every other group loses. And we have what I would define as identity fragmentation. We've come from understanding that identity is shaped in the context of a community that agrees on what matters, to my identity is defined by the distinct number of groups that I am a part of. But God starts the Shema by acknowledging that what gets our attention is not driven by our own individual decisions. It is a corporate decision. It is a communal decision. And so we must guard carefully. We must guard extremely carefully the community that we gather around, the way that we associate, because it can drive learning in an incredible direction, or it can drive our attention to see everything wrong, but also all that will ensure that we never end up where it is that God wants us to go. Your attention is the most valuable thing that you have. And Ian McGilchrist says it like this: attention is a moral act. It's a moral act. What you attend to will ultimately dictate who you are. So we must guard it carefully. We must drive our focus towards the very few things that are worth this deeply valuable resource. And perhaps I'll leave you with this from the movie Lady Bird. The nun responds to Lady Bird by saying, "Aren't they the same thing, attention and love? And the way we love well is by devoting our complete and full attention to that which deserves it." Let's pray. Infinite God, thank you for, in infinite ways, providing us the cues on where to devote our attention so that we become more like you in every way, and in doing so have been given the power to shape who others become that we interact with. Help us to guard our attention, direct our attention to that which will ensure we become more like you. Give us grace when we fail. Help us to remember the Shema at the beginning of our days and at the end of our days, to have it on our doorposts. May we not be distracted by a world filled with it. It's in your precious Son's name we pray. Amen.
This presentation was made possible by the generous contributors to the Serious Joy Scholarship, permitting our graduates to launch into life and ministry without a burden of student loan debt.